At approximately 15 years old, I experienced my first significant romantic relationship. We resided in a rather affluent district, known for its tranquil environment and quiet avenues. My partner, Sarah, happened to live just a couple of blocks away, making it easy for me to stroll over to her place on most evenings. One specific Thursday during a school break, finding myself with no particular plans, I decided to make my way towards Sarah's house. It was quite late in the evening, but since I didn't really adhere to a strict curfew, the timing wasn't a concern. However, before long, I became aware of certain sounds emanating from my surroundings. By around me, I primarily mean from behind. The initial sound I distinguished was akin to a bush being lightly disturbed. I merely glanced back briefly without pausing my stride. I simply began to accelerate my walk a little. Upon reaching the subsequent block, another distinct noise registered, the snapping of a small branch or twig. This time, I halted and turned around completely. All I could see was the deserted street and the rows of shrubs that demarcated the boundaries between the pavement and the properties. Essentially, alongside the road was a thick barrier of foliage, and there was absolutely no person or object visible that could have been generating these peculiar sounds. I quickened my pace even further, now nearing the final stretch to Sarah's dwelling. Predictably, another sound occurred. On this occasion, it sounded more like footsteps, rapid, light ones. I turned again but kept moving. Still no one, nothing I could discern. Sarah's house was now in sight. I quickly dialed her number and she answered instantly. I conveyed how unsettling I was feeling due to the persistent noises I was hearing. I walked around the perimeter of the bushes bordering her driveway and stepped onto her property. I noticed her observing me from her bedroom window on the upper level. She waved while still on the phone, and I returned the gesture. Then she posed a question. "Who is that individual right behind you?" I spun around immediately and observed a fully grown male figure moving in a low crouch, perhaps situated about 20 feet behind me. I emitted a scream and dashed for the door, starting to pound on it frantically. The individual seized me and attempted to apply some sort of restraint around my head, but he released his grip and quickly fled the scene. Sarah's mother opened the door, her face etched with concern. She quickly ushered me inside and secured the door shut just as Sarah came rushing over. I was breathless, my heart pounding like a drum solo. Sarah's mother embraced me and posed a few questions, then proceeded to contact the authorities to alert them about a potentially dangerous individual in the area. For obvious reasons, Sarah's mother allowed me to stay the night, and she drove me back home the following day. It was a fiercely turbulent night outside. My family members were all occupied with their own activities. I was in my room absorbed in watching a television program. My mother was engrossed in a book in the living room, while my sibling was completing academic tasks upstairs. I typically found nights like this marked by storms quite soothing. They induced a sense of calm. That tranquility lasted until a thunderous impact struck my window pane. I sprang up and peered outdoors. There was indeed someone positioned outside my window, though the deluge of rain streaming down the glass obscured his features somewhat. He commenced striking the window vigorously. It sounded as though he was crying out for assistance, I opened the window just a fraction and he cried out, "Let me inside, I'm hurt." The rain was so loud that I had to shout back at him, instructing him to make his way around to the front entrance. Following this, I rapidly secured my window shut. I hurried out to the living room to inform my father that there was an individual who appeared to be in distress and yelling for help just outside our dwelling. And then, the sound shifted. Knocks and urgent calls for help now resounded from our main door. My father was about to open the front door, but I intervened. I told him to wait, expressing my uncertainty about the wisdom of doing so. Just then the telephone rang, and the television screen displayed the incoming call identification. It was our adjacent neighbor. My father rushed to answer it, and I overheard him exclaim, "No way!" At that moment I realized something was seriously amiss. He ended the call and instructed me to stay away from the door. He offered no explanation, but immediately moved to the window to cautiously inspect the front porch area. It was from there that he reported seeing a male figure hunched down, pounding on the door while clutching some kind of sizable, sharp implement. My father yelled through the closed front door at the man, ordering him to depart before the police arrived. He then actually proceeded to contact the emergency services himself. Eventually, the individual outside ceased his efforts and vanished. The next time we looked, he was gone. While my father was on the phone with the neighbor, he learned that his neighbor had observed a person who appeared unkempt or transient rifling through his storage shed and emerging with a substantial garden spade. The police eventually located the agitated man roaming the nearby streets, and the incident was reported in the local newspaper a few days afterward. One evening, when I was a very young child, I was situated in the living room watching my preferred animated program. The television volume was set quite high, but I believed I could discern the sound of my mother calling my name from the lower level of the house. I responded verbally, but she didn't reply, so I presumed she couldn't hear me. I heard her summon me again, prompting me to descend to the basement. The lights were off down there, so about halfway down the staircase I called out for my mother. She did not answer. I wasn't sure from where exactly she might be calling, but one thing was definite. She was not in the basement itself. I started to make my way back up the stairs. However, before I even reached the topmost step, I heard my mother's voice once more originating from within the basement below, calling my name. I peered down into the absolute darkness. I quickly ascended back to the top step, activated the light switch that illuminated the basement stairs, and descended halfway again, cautiously looking into the basement space. I could not see my mother anywhere down there. Suddenly, an intense wave of terror washed over me. I scrambled up the stairs rapidly, essentially crying out for my mother. She came hurrying down the stairs from the upper floor, and I tearfully explained to her that something sounding exactly like her voice had been calling me from the lower level. She adamantly assured me that she had not been calling my name at all. She went down to the basement to investigate, hoping to alleviate my fear, but I didn't feel any better. I'm certain she didn't entirely credit my account. Why would she? I was just a small child, but I still know unequivocally that I heard what I heard. My grandparent recently recounted a tale. It was concerning a trekker. He was out for a walk with his canine companion. He used to have a small beagle named Daisy, a name he chose in memory of a childhood pet. My grandparent resides roughly a 2-hour drive from us on a rural property where life is generally quite uneventful. He shares his home with his spouse, Eleanor, whom he wed approximately 20 years ago. Each morning, Eleanor would take Daisy for her walk, and my grandparent would do so in the evenings. On a routine evening walk, as the sun began to set, my grandparent was walking Daisy along the usual unpaved route that bordered the wooded area adjacent to their land. My grandparent encountered another person on the path. Daisy, as dogs often do around strangers, instinctively barked and strained towards the individual. My grandparent offered a greeting to the stranger, who was wearing a dark coat that obscured his face. But the stranger simply continued walking past without any acknowledgement. So, my grandparent and the dog continued their walk. Daisy persistently glanced back periodically and barked. My grandparent had to frequently urge her forward, gently tugging the lead to keep her moving. Eventually, my grandparent decided to turn around to see what Daisy was continuing to react to. The stranger who had passed him a few minutes prior was now observing him from behind a large tree in the near distance. My grandparent resolved to quicken his pace as much as possible, considering his advancing years. He always carried a small personal alarm device in his pocket for safety, just in case. He was getting closer to the house when abruptly he heard soft disturbances in the fallen leaves just steps behind him. But before he could fully turn, he felt the warmth of a gloved hand cover his mouth and nose, cutting off his ability to shout or breathe. My grandparent recalls hearing Daisy barking and attempting to nip at the individual, which may have contributed to a slight loosening of the man's hold. He recounts struggling to retrieve the personal alarm from his pocket, but when he finally did, he activated it continuously, producing a piercing sound, even after the man who had been holding him released his grip and began to cry out in discomfort. My grandparent retreated as quickly as he could, close to a run, to escape back to his house. He emerged from the ordeal physically unharmed. For the first 12 years of my life, I resided in Texas. Our locality wasn't considered particularly safe, mainly because it was known territory for a certain street gang called the Cobras. If you're unfamiliar, the Cobras are members of a sizable urban gang presence. My close companion, whom I consistently referred to as Marky A, lived just a few houses away. We had other friends naturally, but often we'd just spend time together, solely the two of us. Our usual activities involved riding our bicycles around the neighborhood or engaging in video games. Essentially typical childhood pursuits. When we were 12, we were cycling through the neighborhood one evening and decided to visit a widely known unoccupied dwelling. It had remained vacant for many years, unpurchased for reasons unknown. As we pulled up on our bikes to the front of the property, Marky pointed towards a window and exclaimed, "Look!" I nudged my bike a little closer to the window and focused my gaze upon it. I could discern someone peering out through the window. I couldn't determine if they were looking directly at us, but it was undoubtedly a human face situated between the curtains. It was extraordinarily strange, given that the place had been uninhabited for ages. We stared for perhaps longer than was prudent and then noticed another peculiar detail. The face of the person remained completely still. It didn't move at all. We cautiously advanced a little closer onto the empty driveway. Upon getting nearer, it appeared to be some sort of decorative item, possibly a Halloween prop, perhaps a simulated head. This implied that someone had illicitly entered the house to position it there. Marky A and I, being the somewhat mischievous kids we were at that time, conceived an idea. To attempt to gain entry somehow through the rear and explore the premises. We concealed our bicycles behind a large old oak tree at the side of the house, then quietly made our way into the backyard. To our astonishment, the back door was already unsecured. However, on reflection, it wasn't entirely surprising, considering it seemed someone had already intruded to place that artificial head. We stepped inside the house, but we deliberately avoided activating the lights, not wanting to reveal our presence within the dwelling. The interior was dark, yet not completely devoid of light, allowing us to navigate our way through the rooms. We first reached the living room, driven by our desire to investigate that head object at the window. The room had a noticeably unpleasant odor. I lifted the head from the windowsill and immediately dropped it, letting out a gasp. I dropped it not because of any unexpected weight, but because it felt disturbingly like real skin. I then observed a dark, viscous liquid pooling from the base of the head, now lying on the floor. It was blood. It was, in fact, an authentic human head. Concurrently, we heard two distinct sounds from the ceiling directly above us. Marky and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, our mouths agape in shock. We bolted for the back door and scrambled onto our bikes to flee the area as quickly as possible. It wasn't long before residents in our immediate vicinity learned that the head belonged to an individual who had been a victim of the Cobra's gang, apparently placed there as some form of communication or warning. I don't believe anyone ever fully grasped the complete narrative. But there was a significant possibility that whoever had placed the head there was still inside the house. Given that both Marky and I had heard noises originating from the ceiling above, suggesting someone might be descending the stairs. Just the previous year, an individual arrived at the entrance of my residence around 9 in the evening. He knocked on the door, so I alerted my mother and she went out to ascertain who it was. It's worth noting that we reside in a rather secluded area, making such late visits highly unusual and peculiar. The man engaged my mother in conversation, mentioning he was initiating a local enterprise and inquiring whether she favored locally produced items. Then presented her with a package of cleaning wipes as a complimentary item. He returned to his utility vehicle and opened it, ostensibly to retrieve what he termed a floor cleaner. When my mother saw 4 other men seated inside, she quickly instructed me to rush inside and locate my communication device, as we didn't have a fixed phone line. Unable to find it, I instead grabbed a heavy flashlight and positioned myself discreetly around the corner. She tossed the package of wipes back outside and adamantly told them to leave her property immediately, adding that she was in the process of contacting law enforcement. They rapidly reversed the van out of the driveway and sped away, and we never saw that vehicle again. I've always been drawn to adrenaline-fueled activities since my early years. Activities like river rafting, climbing steep rock faces, and soaring through the air via skydiving were among them. However, I've maintained a strong passion for skiing. I'd travel to mountainous areas for skiing 8 or more times each season, sometimes with companions, occasionally by myself. My friend, whom I'll refer to as Alex, consented to join me on a trip upstate for camping and some backcountry skiing. This essentially means skiing in areas away from marked trails or patrolled zones outside the perimeters of established ski resorts. The journey involved a 3-hour drive followed by a considerable amount of travel over rough terrain to reach the desired hilly area. I parked my pickup at the base of a promising-looking locale dotted with hills, stopping there also because I couldn't proceed much further due to the dense trees. Alex and I then commenced unloading the rear of my truck, retrieving all our belongings, including our skiing gear and camping provisions. Following this, we hiked approximately half a kilometer, which was quite strenuous carrying all the equipment. We identified an ideal spot to establish our camp, situated near the foot of an incline within a somewhat open space among the trees. Our initial priority was erecting the tent and arranging our sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and other supplies. Once that was completed, we began our ascent up the hill to survey the surroundings. We did a fair amount of hiking, but also managed to get a significant amount of skiing in. At one point, while skiing down a larger slope, Alex and I became separated. I assumed we would reconvene at the bottom or that I would simply find him eventually. I checked the communication device we carried just to see if he would respond, but he didn't, leading me to believe he was likely still making his way downhill. At some stage, while walking with my skis at the lower part of the hill, I encountered another individual, another skier. He sounded quite amiable from beneath his ski mask, inquiring about the best slopes and whether we were camping, among other things. He had his skis attached to his blue backpack. I indicated the slope I had just descended and also gestured in the direction where we had set up our camp. He mentioned that he and his companion were attempting to find a suitable place to camp in proximity to other people and asked if I could guide him to my campsite. Although I truly didn't relish the prospect of trekking all the way back there, I felt a sense of obligation to act charitably and assist this man and his companion. I took out my communication device again and spoke into it, informing Alex that I was returning to the campsite briefly. I started leading the man who was following behind me when suddenly I began to receive some interference on the device. It appeared someone, likely Alex, was attempting to communicate with me, but the signal was poor, essentially non-existent. There was nothing I could do about it in that moment except plan to return to this location afterward. It involved a decent amount of hiking and light conversation with the man before we reached the camping spot. I turned to face him and offered a smile beneath my ski mask, instantly realizing the pointlessness of the gesture. He expressed considerable gratitude on behalf of himself and his companion, and I finally posed the question, "Where is your companion?" He didn't reply. He began to move closer towards me. Initially, I thought nothing of it, but for some inexplicable reason, something about his skis and backpack suddenly struck me. They belonged to Alex. For a fleeting moment, I wondered, is this Alex? Is he playing a joke? But it couldn't be. His voice was distinctly different from Alex's. The man was now mere feet away from me, and his approach was becoming faster, more intimidating. I panicked and scrambled into the tent, digging through my gear for my flare pistol. The man seized my leg, which was still protruding from the tent opening. And then I experienced a sharp, intense sensation in my limb, similar to a severe electrical jolt, followed by a burning heat. I cried out in agony as I just managed to retrieve the flare pistol, push aside the tent flap, and aim it at the man. He immediately retreated, raising his hands in surrender. It was then that I noticed the bladed tool embedded deeply in my leg. I ordered the man to disclose the location of my friend. He quickly answered, saying he was near the base of the hill where he had initially encountered me. I instructed the man to remain still while I contacted emergency services to request an immediate airlift rescue. However, the man easily made his escape while I was on the phone. With only a single flare round available, there wasn't much more I could do. It felt as though I was waiting there in the cold with my injured leg for an eternity until, at last, the reassuring sound of a rescue helicopter became audible overhead, and I discharged my flare pistol. I could barely believe I was actually being airlifted. The helicopter also assisted in locating my friend, who was found lying in the snow midway up the hill. He was unconscious and had also sustained a single cut wound to his leg, after which he had been robbed. He had attempted to communicate with me via the radio device while he was losing consciousness, but the connection had been too weak. We both received medical attention at the hospital and are fine today. I resided in a modest university town. My living quarters were conveniently situated within walking distance of the entertainment district and downtown area. One evening during the week, I stepped out onto the front porch of our apartment building to have a smoke. I was up late, engrossed in academic work. I brought my course material with me and reclined on the steps while I smoked. A young woman whom I had not previously met, but who occupied an apartment on the ground floor adjacent to mine, returned home from downtown. She was by herself, and her gait indicated she had been consuming alcohol. She entered her apartment and had barely secured the door before a male figure who appeared seemingly from nowhere knocked on her door. She opened it, and I observed him introduce himself, which struck me as peculiar given it was around 2:30 in the morning. Who approaches a random young woman's apartment at that hour? Consequently, I decided to remain outside and observe the situation. They ended up conversing for over 10 minutes. She later confided in me how unsettling the situation was, but also that she felt unsure how to politely terminate the interaction. He engaged in several unsettling actions, such as reaching out and lightly touching her arm several times and consistently attempting to slowly advance his position closer into the doorway space towards her. I intentionally made noise by shuffling my course notes loudly, ensuring he was aware of my presence. And he then vanished as mysteriously as he had materialized. We alerted the police, and a few days later, both the young woman and I were asked to work with a forensic sketch artist. As soon as the generated composite sketch was publicly disseminated, a surge of calls flooded in. The individual was identified as a prolific assailant who targeted lone young women returning from establishments, often posing as a taxi service offering them a ride. This particular woman was fortunate simply because her residence was so close to the district that he didn't have the opportunity to implement his standard procedure. I have utilized the online platform Craigslist on merely one occasion in my lifetime, and that single experience left a profoundly negative impression. Allow me to explain why. An individual had posted an advertisement for a sturdy workbench that I was interested in acquiring for my brother and myself. We arranged a specific time for me to come and collect the item that evening. I had to remove the rear seating from my utility vehicle to ensure the item would fit inside. I drove up and parked in front of the seller's residence and sent him a brief message indicating my arrival. I saw his door open, so I exited my vehicle and quickly approached his front entrance to greet him. I extended my hand for a handshake, but I don't believe he registered my gesture, resulting in an awkward few seconds before I lowered my hand. He instructed me in his low, gravelly voice to follow him down to the lower level. The entire structure emitted a peculiar, distinctive scent. Not necessarily unpleasant or alarming, but a strange, damp, musty sort of odor. We reached the basement, and there it was, the workbench situated prominently in the center of the room. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Oh dear, I seem to have misplaced the necessary bolts." He then quickly ascended the stairs, telling me to remain there and wait. I waited there for a considerable time, assuming he had simply misplaced the components and was experiencing difficulty locating them. I began to look around his basement area somewhat, observing various items including framed photographs. It was odd. He had pictures displayed on furniture, but they were all images solely of himself, with no other family members present. There was one photograph where he was at least accompanied by a canine, but that was essentially the extent of it. I'd estimate 10 minutes passed, and I was still waiting, so I became increasingly curious. There was a small utility area, or workshop room at the rear of his basement that caught my attention. For some reason, a drawer on his work desk was partially open. I pulled it fully open, revealing a collection of old photographic prints. These images were truly horrific and deeply disturbing. They were all photographs taken of a young woman who appeared to be confined to a seat, her mouth obscured with tape. There were also rows of red folders stacked beside the photographs. They were labeled sequentially from 1 through 20. I couldn't bring myself to open the folders and see what contents were held within. I retrieved my mobile device to capture images of the drawer's contents, intending to send them to my friends immediately. But I discovered I had no cellular service down there. It was unequivocally time to leave. I hurried back to the door at the top of the staircase, but my unsettling experience only intensified upon finding that the door was secured from the outside. However, as soon as I attempted to turn the doorknob, I heard the deep, husky voice of the man speaking from the opposite side of the door. He was apologizing, explaining that the door had been inadvertently locked, and that he would quickly go find the appropriate key. I offered no verbal response. I closely examined the keyhole. I then swiftly returned downstairs to the man's work desk, selected a couple of narrow metal files of different sizes, and attempted to insert each one into the rectangular-shaped keyhole of the door. One of the smaller files successfully fit within the opening, allowing me to manipulate it just enough to disengage the lock and open the door. I did not pause or look back. I simply ran out the door and into my vehicle. I did not cast a glance back at the dwelling. I simply drove directly to the nearest law enforcement precinct. I presented them with the photographs, provided the address, and indicated where they could locate the physical copies of the images. This was sufficient evidence for them to commence their investigation. A few days later, I received comprehensive details. The individual was involved in distributing illicit material online via hidden networks, apparently how he sustained himself. As for why he decided to confine me in his basement, that remains a mystery to me. I haven't the faintest notion of his intentions for me, but it was clearly nothing positive. During my adolescent years, I occasionally undertook childcare duties. At 14 years old, I was engaged to look after a 5-year-old boy named Leo. Once his guardians departed, they provided me with limited directives, primarily to order a pizza for our meal and to ensure Leo did not enter their private bedroom. They also offered an interesting observation, noting that Leo tended to behave somewhat differently from other children, and that he would often converse with himself or an unseen companion, particularly while playing with his toys. So it was midday, and heavy rain was falling outside. I was watching reruns of a vintage game show that used to be broadcast in the early 2000s. Leo was on the floor, engaged with his toys scattered across the living room area. Leo repeatedly used the name Oscar. He would act as though he were interacting with another child seated directly in front of him. One of his toys, situated across the room from where he was playing, suddenly became active on its own. I found this particularly strange because the toy was a small musical box that played a tune when a specific part was turned. It was the kind of toy that required physical action to initiate its function, and yet it activated spontaneously. I inquired of Leo how this was possible. He looked at me and replied, "Oscar is playing with it." I must admit, hearing him say that was slightly unsettling. I collected the toy and turned it off. That evening, in the final hour before his guardians were due to return, I was cleaning up in the kitchen when I heard a soft tap at the door frame. "Leo!" I called out. I opened the door, but Leo was not there. I looked down the hallway for Leo. One of the doors at the far end of the corridor began to slowly, very slowly creak open. I switched off the kitchen light and cautiously stepped into the hallway, anticipating that Leo might be playing around, attempting to startle me. Instead, Leo was positioned on the bed in the distant corner of the room, looking towards me. I asked him who had just caused the door to open. "Oscar," he responded. Now genuinely perturbed, I approached Leo on the bed and brought him back to the living room, where we remained for the rest of my shift until his guardians arrived. I did not mention any of the peculiar occurrences that had transpired. However, when they contacted me a few weeks later to inquire about booking me to look after Leo again, I declined to return their call,